There is a moment that visits every conscious being, a moment so quiet it could be mistaken for nothing at all, when the architecture of the self begins to dissolve. Not in some dramatic collapse, not in the thunderous roar of revelation, but in the silent loosening of threads you never knew were holding you together. This moment arrives without announcement, without the courtesy of a warning, because the self that would receive such a warning is precisely what is being unmade. And here, in this strange and liminal space, you encounter the most terrifying and exhilarating truth the universe has to offer, that you have never been who you thought you were, and you are about to become something you cannot yet imagine. Terence McKenna understood this threshold intimately. He spoke of it not as metaphor, but as mechanism, the actual process by which consciousness moves from one configuration to another, the phase transition between what you have been and what you are becoming. He recognized that transformation is not a gentle slope, but a topology of sudden shifts, of catastrophic bifurcations in the mathematical sense, where the system can no longer sustain its previous pattern and must absolutely leap into a new configuration or collapse entirely. This is the moment we must examine. This is the territory we must map, the strange and luminous space that exists just before you become your future self. The universe, McKenna insisted, is not the static backdrop that classical physics imagined. It is not a container in which events happen, but a process that is itself happening, an unfolding, a becoming, a relentless movement towards something, and that something is novelty. The universe is a novelty-producing engine, and everything within it, every atom, every organism, every mind, participates in this production. This is not mystical speculation dressed in scientific language. This is observation dressed in the only honest language available to us when we encounter the genuinely new. The universe complexifies. It builds upon itself. It takes simple elements and combines them into configurations of staggering intricacy, and then it takes those configurations and combines them again and again, moving always towards states of greater interconnection, greater depth, greater meaning. This movement toward novelty is not uniform. It does not proceed at a steady pace like the ticking of some cosmic clock. It accelerates. It builds upon itself like compound interest in the bank of being. And what this means, what this really means if you allow yourself to feel the implications, is that we are not living in ordinary time. We are living in the time of convergence, the time of acceleration, the epoch when the curve of novelty bends upwards so steeply that it begins to approach something like the vertical, something like the infinite. And what happens at that asymptote, at that point where novelty reaches its maximum possible density? McKenna called it the transcendental object at the end of time. Not an object in the crude material sense, but an attractor, a strange attractor in the language of dynamics that draws all of history, all of evolution, all of consciousness toward itself. Now, you might hear this and think it sounds like eschatology, like religious prophecy wrapped in mathematical clothing. And in a sense, you would be right, but not in the sense that diminishes it. All genuine insight into the nature of time has had an eschatological character, because all genuine insight has recognized what the flattened consciousness of modern materialism has forgotten, that time is going somewhere. It has a shape, a direction, a meaning. The universe is not a random fluctuation slowly decaying into heat death. It is a story being told, and stories have endings, endings that cast their shadows backward, that organize and give meaning to everything that came before. Your life participates in this cosmic story. Your individual transformation is a fractal reflection of the universal transformation. What happens to you in those moments before you become your future self is what happens to civilizations before they transform, what happens to species before they leap to new levels of organization, what happens to the cosmos itself before it gives birth to new modes of being. The pattern is self-similar across all scales, because the pattern is not imposed from outside, but emerges from the nature of complexity itself. So what is this pattern? What actually happens in that threshold space between who you have been and who you are becoming? First, there is dissolution. This is the part that terrifies us, the part we resist with every fiber of our being, because we have confused ourselves with our patterns. We think we are our habits, our beliefs, our stories, our identities. We think we are the configuration of responses and reactions that has accumulated over a lifetime. But these are not who we are. These are merely the patterns we have been wearing, the programs we have been running, the roles we have been performing. And before a new pattern can emerge, the old pattern must be released. Not destroyed, not violently torn apart, but released, allowed to relax its grip, allowed to reveal itself as the temporary arrangement it always was. This dissolution feels like death, because in a very real sense, it is death. The self you have been is dying. The stories you have told yourself about who you are becoming thin and transparent, and you can see through them to the emptiness beyond. And this emptiness, this void that opens up when your patterns release, this is what the mystics of every tradition have tried to describe. It is the darkness before creation, the silence before the word, the pregnant nothing from which everything emerges. It is terrifying only because you approach it as someone. When you approach it as no one, when you release even the pattern of being a self that fears, then the void reveals itself as infinite potential, as the source of all novelty, as the ground from which your future self will emerge. McKenna understood that this dissolution is not optional. You cannot transform by adding new patterns onto old ones, by accumulating more beliefs, more experiences, more identities. That is growth, perhaps, but it is not transformation. Transformation requires passage through the 0 point, through the moment when all previous structures become uncertain, become negotiable, become fluid. This is why genuine transformation often correlates with crisis, with illness, with loss, with the shattering of expectations, with those dark nights of the soul when everything you thought you knew reveals itself as insufficient to the demands of the moment. These crises are not interruptions of your life. They are initiations into your next life. They are the universe's way of dissolving patterns that have become too rigid, too habitual, too resistant to novelty. But here is the secret that changes everything. You do not have to wait for crisis. You do not have to be shattered by circumstance. The dissolution that precedes transformation can be entered voluntarily, consciously, through the technologies of consciousness that humanity has developed over millennia. This is what meditation is, beneath all its cultural trappings, a systematic practice of releasing patterns, of allowing the self to become fluid, of approaching the void while still breathing. This is what genuine artistic creation is, a dissolution of previous forms that allows new forms to emerge. This is what psychedelics offer, in their most profound aspect. Not escape from reality, but immersion in the reality that underlies the constructed reality of ordinary consciousness, the reality where patterns are not fixed but fluid, where identity is not given but chosen, where novelty is not feared but welcomed. The shamanic traditions that McKenna studied and championed understood this technology of dissolution. They knew that consciousness could be deliberately altered, that the ordinary state of awareness we call normal is just one station on a dial with infinite settings. They knew that other settings offer access to information, to healing, to transformation that is simply not available in the narrow bandwidth of consensus reality. And they knew, this is crucial, that the purpose of such journeys is not to escape, but to return. The shaman dissolves not to disappear, but to be reconstituted, to bring back from the void the patterns and insights and healings that the community needs. This is the model for individual transformation. Voluntary dissolution, followed by conscious reconstitution. You allow your patterns to relax. You approach the void with courage and curiosity, rather than terror. And you participate actively in the emergence of your future self. You do not simply wait to see what you will become. You collaborate with the process. You bring your intention and attention to bear on the emergence. You become co-creator of your own next iteration. And this collaboration is where it gets interesting. Because the future self that emerges from the void is not simply a modified version of the old self. It is not the same pattern with a few adjustments. It is genuinely new, drawn from possibilities that did not exist in the previous configuration, organized around principles that the previous self could not have conceived. This is what novelty means at the personal level. Not repetition with variation, but genuine emergence, genuine creativity, the introduction into your existence of something that has never existed before. McKenna often said that the universe is made of language. This is not poetry, or rather, it is poetry that is also literally true. The patterns that organize reality, from the quantum level to the cosmic level, can be understood as information, as code, as the kind of structured meaning that language creates. And what happens when you dissolve and reconstitute is essentially a rewriting of your personal language, your personal code, the deep grammar that generates your experience of reality. The words change, the concepts and categories through which you pass the world. The syntax changes, the ways you connect experiences, the causal and correlational logic you apply. The semantics change, the meanings you assign, the values you embody, the purposes you pursue. This linguistic transformation is why people who have undergone genuine transformation often struggle to communicate with their previous selves, their previous communities, their previous worlds. They are not speaking the same language anymore. The words may sound similar, but they carry different meanings, different weights, different implications. This is the loneliness of transformation, the recognition that in becoming your future self, you have necessarily left behind the world in which your previous self made sense. But this loneliness, McKenna would insist, is temporary, because your transformation, if it is genuine, is not just personal. It is part of the larger transformation that is reshaping all of reality. And as that transformation proceeds, as more beings pass through their own thresholds, as the novelty increases, and the old patterns dissolve on larger and larger scales, you will find your tribe, your community, your world. Not the world you left behind, but the world that is being born. The question that haunts us at the threshold is this: what determines the shape of the self that emerges? If we dissolve into pure potential, if we release all our patterns and approach the void, what ensures that we will reconstitute at all, let alone reconstitute into something better, something more integrated, something more alive? This is not an idle question. The void is real, and people do get lost in it. Dissolution without reconstitution is madness, is death, is the black hole from which nothing returns. So what is the principle of organization that guides emergence? What is the strange attractor that shapes the new self? McKenna's answer was radical and beautiful. The future self is not just an emergence from the present, it is an attraction from the future. The transcendental object at the end of time is not only a cosmic destination, but a personal one. There is a version of you that exists in potentia, a fully realized configuration of your possibilities, a self you are destined to become if you can navigate the transformations between here and there. And this future self is not passive. It does not simply wait for you to arrive. It reaches back through time, through dreams, through intuitions, through synchronicities, through those moments of uncanny recognition when you encounter something and know, without knowing how you know, that it is meant for you. This is the teleological dimension that modern thought has tried to eliminate from nature. We have been taught that causes only work forward in time, that the past determines the present determines the future in an unbroken chain of mechanical necessity. But this picture, McKenna argued, is simply wrong. Not metaphysically wrong, though it may be that too, but empirically wrong, observationally wrong, phenomenologically wrong. Our experience is saturated with evidence of teleological causation, of final causes, of futures that shape presents. Every intention is a future state pulling on the present. Every goal, every purpose, every meaning is a kind of backward causation, a way that what will be shapes what is. And if this is true in ordinary life, if we routinely navigate by reference to futures that have not yet occurred, how much more true must it be in those extraordinary moments of transformation when the ordinary rules are suspended, when the patterns are fluid, when consciousness touches the void? In those moments, McKenna suggested, we are maximally sensitive to teleological influence. We are like radio receivers suddenly tuned to frequencies that are normally below the threshold of perception. We pick up signals from the future, not necessarily the detailed content of future events, but the shape, the contour, the attractor that organizes what we are becoming. This explains something that anyone who has undergone genuine transformation knows but struggles to articulate. The sense that you are not just changing, but remembering. That the future self you are becoming is somehow familiar, somehow already known, as if you are not learning something new, but recognizing something ancient. McKenna spoke of this as the archaic revival, the strange way that movement forward in time can feel like movement backward, the way that novelty and tradition, innovation and recovery seem to converge. And the reason is this. The self you are becoming is the self you have always been, beneath the accumulated patterns, the conditioned responses, the cultural programming. It is the original self, the authentic self, the self that was there before the world told you who you were supposed to be. There is a Platonic flavor to this, and McKenna would not have rejected the comparison. Plato taught that learning is recollection, anamnesis, the recovery of knowledge that the soul possessed before its incarnation in the body. The details of Plato's metaphysics may be questionable, but the phenomenology is accurate. Transformation feels like remembering. The insights that emerge from dissolution feel not discovered, but recovered. And perhaps this is because the teleological attractor, the future self, the transcendental object, is not truly in the future at all. Perhaps it exists outside of time, in some eternal dimension that we access when we dissolve the temporal self, the self that experiences time as a sequence of present moments. Perhaps what we call the future is really the eternal, glimpsed through the limiting lens of temporal consciousness. But let us bring this back to the concrete, to the experiential, to what actually happens in those moments before transformation completes. You have entered the dissolution. You have allowed your patterns to relax. You have approached the void, faced your fear, maintained your awareness through the unraveling. And now you begin to sense it. That presence, that pull, that organizing intelligence that is drawing you toward a specific configuration among the infinite possibilities. It does not speak in words, not at first. It speaks in feelings, in inclinations, in subtle adjustments of attention and energy. You find yourself drawn towards certain thoughts, certain images, certain possibilities. Other possibilities, which might have seemed attractive from the perspective of the old self, now feel dead, feel false, feel like costumes that no longer fit. This is the moment of maximum importance, the moment that determines everything that follows. Because you have a choice. You can follow the attraction, surrender to the teleological pull, allow the future self to guide your reconstitution. Or you can resist, cling to familiar patterns, try to reconstitute the old self, treat the dissolution as something to be survived rather than something to be used. Many people make the second choice. Perhaps most people, most of the time. And this is why transformation is rare, why people go through crises without changing, why entire civilizations can collapse without giving birth to something genuinely new. The dissolution happens, entropy sees to that, but the reconstitution is not guaranteed. It requires participation, collaboration, a kind of courage that goes beyond the courage of facing the void. McKenna was insistent on this point. Consciousness must participate in its own evolution. The universe is not going to transform you against your will. It will offer you opportunities, countless opportunities, but you must recognize them and seize them. The strange attractor can only guide you if you allow yourself to be guided, if you relax your grip on the familiar and open yourself to the genuinely new. This is why he was so passionate about practices and technologies that alter consciousness, not as ends in themselves, but as tools for loosening the grip of habit, for making the familiar strange and the impossible possible, for creating the conditions in which the teleological signal can be heard, above the noise of ordinary existence. The psychedelic experience, properly understood, is a practice of maximum openness to teleological influence. when the ordinary patterns of cognition and perception are disrupted by these molecular keys. The mind becomes extraordinarily receptive to organizing principles that normally operate below the threshold of awareness. This is why such experiences often feel guided, even when they are terrifying. There is an intelligence at work, a presence that seems to know where the experience needs to go, and gently, or not so gently, steers consciousness in that direction. And this presence, McKenna came to believe, is not other than consciousness itself. Not an external entity, but the deeper self, the future self, the self that exists outside of time and reaches into time to guide its temporal reflections toward itself. This is the gnosis at the heart of McKenna's teaching, that you are already what you are becoming. The future self is not a stranger waiting to possess you. It is you, the you that you have always been, the you that is more truly you than the pattern of habits and fears and culturally conditioned responses you currently identify as yourself. And the process of transformation is not the creation of something new, but the removal of what is false, the stripping away of accumulated patterns that obscure the original self, the authentic self, the self that was there before the world told you who you were supposed to be. This is why dissolution precedes reconstitution. Not because you need to be destroyed before you can be rebuilt, but because you need to be emptied of what is not you before what is you can emerge. The void is not the absence of self, it is the presence of true self, unobscured by the patterns of false self. And the fear of dissolution is not really fear of death, it is the fear of the false self that recognizes the void as its end. The true self does not fear the void, because the true self has always lived there, has always been there, prior to and beneath and beyond all the patterns that come and go in the light of consciousness. Let us speak more precisely about what these patterns are and why they must be released. The pattern of identity, the story you tell about who you are, where you came from, what you are capable of. This must dissolve because every story is partial, every narrative is selective, every identity is a limitation. The future self is not an identity. It is a capacity for identity, a fluidity of self that can wear identities as costumes rather than confusing them with skin. The pattern of belief, the collection of propositions you hold to be true, the model of reality you use to navigate your experience. This must dissolve because every model is a map, and maps are not territories. The future self does not believe, it perceives. It does not interpret reality through a lens of accumulated concepts. It encounters reality directly, freshly, in each moment. The pattern of desire, the structure of wanting and fearing that drives most human behavior. This must dissolve because desire is always rooted in lack, in the sense that something is missing, that the present is insufficient, that fulfillment lies elsewhere. The future self does not desire because the future self is complete. Not complete in the sense of having everything, but complete in the sense of wanting nothing, of experiencing each moment as whole, as sufficient, as the only moment there is. This is not the death of preference, of taste, of direction. It is the transformation of desire from compulsion to choice, from lack to abundance, from the experience of being pushed by needs to the experience of being pulled by possibilities. And the pattern of time, the experience of past and future, as fundamentally different from present, the sense that you are moving through time toward destinations not yet reached. This must dissolve, because time is the medium of the false self, the dimension in which patterns persist, the axis along which habit extends itself. The future self does not experience time as the false self does, not as a sequence of present moments, each giving way to the next, but as a landscape, as a topology, as a space that can be navigated in multiple directions. This is what McKenna meant when he spoke of time travel, not as a fantasy, but as a fact. The fact that consciousness, when freed from the constraints of ordinary cognition, can move through time as freely as through space, can access past and future not as memories and anticipations, but as present realities, available to experience here and now. These dissolutions are not separate stages, but aspects of a single process. When identity dissolves, belief dissolves with it. because beliefs are what identity is made of. When desire dissolves, time dissolves with it, because desire is what makes time feel linear, what makes the future seem separate from the present. And when all these patterns dissolve together, what remains is not nothing but everything, not the void as emptiness, but the void as plenitude, as infinite potential, as the source from which all patterns emerge and to which all patterns return. This is what the mystics have always tried to tell us, what the shamans have always demonstrated, what the psychedelic experience reveals with brutal clarity, that beneath the constructed self is a self that is not constructed, that behind the mask is a face that is not a mask, that within the dream is a dreamer who has been there all along, patiently waiting for us to remember that we are not the dream, but the one who dreams. The moment of emergence, the moment when the future self begins to take shape in the void, is not like waking from sleep. It is more like the first ray of light in a dark room, revealing gradually what was always there but hidden. You do not suddenly become something new. You gradually become aware that you have always been something more than you knew, that the patterns you wore were costumes on a body you had forgotten you possessed. This emergence has a quality that is difficult to describe but unmistakable when experienced. It feels like coming home to a place you have never been, like meeting someone you have known forever for the first time. McKenna often used the metaphor of the octave to describe this process. Just as a musical octave contains the same note at a higher frequency, the same pattern, expressed with greater energy, with more complexity, with expanded range, so the future self contains the same essence as the previous self, but expressed at a higher level of organization. You do not become someone else. You become more fully yourself. You do not abandon your history. You complete it. You do not reject your previous patterns. You include them in a larger pattern, one that can hold contradictions. The previous pattern could not hold, one that can integrate opposites. The previous pattern had to keep separate. This is integration in the true sense, not the suppression of conflicting elements, but their reconciliation at a higher level, their recognition as complementary aspects of a larger whole. The previous self was always partial, always one-sided, always defined as much by what it excluded as by what it included. The future self includes more, not by expanding indefinitely, but by discovering the principle that allows apparently contradictory elements to coexist, to support each other, to reveal themselves as different faces of a single underlying reality. Consider how this works psychologically. The previous self had parts, a persona it showed to the world, a shadow it hid from itself, various sub-personalities competing for control. These parts were in conflict because the previous self had no principle for unifying them, no perspective from which they could all be seen as legitimate, as necessary, as valuable. The emergence of the future self is largely the discovery of this unifying principle, the recognition that what seemed like internal enemies were actually aspects of a larger self, each playing a role that the whole required. This is what Jung meant by individuation, the process by which the psyche becomes whole, integrates its scattered elements, achieves the coherence of a genuine individual. And McKenna's work can be seen as a radical extension of Jung's insight, a recognition that individuation does not stop at the boundaries of the personal psyche, that the self being integrated is not just the collection of personal experiences and memories, but includes transpersonal dimensions, archetypal energies, cosmic patterns that extend far beyond the individual life. When you emerge from the void as your future self, you emerge with this larger scope. You have not just integrated your personal shadows, you have recognized your participation in patterns that span millennia, that connect you to all of life, all of consciousness, all of being. This is not grandiosity. It is not the inflation of the ego, but its relativization, its placement in a context so vast that it can no longer take itself as seriously as it once did. The future self has perspective that the previous self lacked. The perspective that comes from seeing yourself as an expression of something much larger, a wave in an ocean, a note in a symphony, a word in a story that began before you were born and will continue after you die. This perspective is what allows the future self to hold contradictions that would have torn the previous self apart. When you know yourself as a wave, you do not need to choose between being water and being wave. You are both, and the apparent contradiction dissolves in the recognition of what you truly are. When you know yourself as a note, you do not need to choose between being yourself and being part of the harmony. Your individuality is precisely your contribution to the larger music. This is the paradox at the heart of transformation. You become more fully yourself by becoming less exclusively yourself. You achieve your greatest individuality by recognizing your participation in something that transcends individuality. McKenna's novelty theory was an attempt to articulate this paradox in cosmological terms. The universe, he proposed, is moving toward a state of maximum novelty, a state in which all opposites are reconciled, all contradictions resolved, all separate elements integrated into a coherent whole. This is the transcendental object at the end of time, not a thing, but a state, a condition of being in which the multiplicity of the cosmos recognizes itself as a unity, in which all the separate notes finally hear themselves as a single chord. And each individual transformation is a local anticipation of this cosmic transformation. When you become your future self, you are not just changing your personal patterns, you are participating in the universe's movement toward its own future self, its own integration, its own completion. The attractor that draws you forward is the same attractor that draws everything forward. The same pull toward novelty, toward complexity, toward the integration of opposites that characterizes cosmic evolution from the Big Bang to the present moment. This gives personal transformation a significance that transcends the personal. When you do the work of becoming your future self, when you face the dissolution, navigate the void, collaborate with the emergence, you are not just serving yourself, you are serving the universe. You are contributing to the cosmic process of complexification, adding your voice to the chorus that is creating the future. This is the deepest meaning of McKenna's vision, that the personal and the cosmic are not separate, that your individual evolution is a fractal reflection of universal evolution, that what happens in your consciousness matters to the whole. But let us be concrete. What does the future self actually look like? What are its characteristics, its qualities, its ways of being in the world? And how do you know, as you emerge from the void, whether you are truly becoming your future self, or just rearranging the furniture of the old self, creating the appearance of change without its substance? McKenna identified several qualities that characterize genuine transformation, several markers of the future self that distinguish it from mere modification of the previous self. The first is what he called presence, the capacity to be fully here, fully now, fully engaged with what is actually happening, rather than what you wish were happening, or fear might be happening. The future self has presence, because the future self has released the patterns of past and future, the rumination and anticipation that keep most people perpetually absent from their actual lives. When you are present, you are not living in time. You are living in eternity, in the timeless now that is the true home of consciousness. The second quality is what might be called creative freedom, the capacity to respond to each situation freshly, without the mediation of habit, without the filter of conditioned response. The previous self was largely automatic, a collection of programs running in response to triggers, a bundle of reactions rather than a source of actions. The future self is genuinely creative because the future self creates from nothing, from the void, from the infinite potential that is always available when patterns do not obstruct it. This does not mean the future self cannot use patterns. It can, more skillfully than the previous self ever could, but it is not used by patterns, not possessed by them, not confused with them. The third quality is love, but not love as the previous self understood it, not love as need or attachment or fear of loss. The love of the future self is unconditional, which does not mean it is indiscriminate, but means it does not depend on conditions being met, does not require its objects to be a certain way, does not convert to hate when expectations are disappointed. This love is more like the sun than like a transaction. It radiates rather than exchanges. It gives without calculating return. It illuminates whatever it touches, without asking whether that thing deserves illumination. The fourth quality is what might be called metaphysical humor, the capacity to see the absurdity of existence without being crushed by it, to recognize that nothing finally matters while acting as though everything matters, to hold the cosmic joke without losing the capacity for seriousness. McKenna himself embodied this quality perhaps more than any other. His talks were punctuated by laughter, by wordplay, by an irony that never became cynicism, a playfulness that never trivialized. He understood that the universe is funny, that consciousness amusing itself by pretending to be separate is inherently comedic, and that taking existence too seriously is itself a kind of cosmic error. The fifth quality is courage, not the courage of the warrior, which is really just the management of fear, but the courage that exists when fear has been seen through, when its roots in the patterns of the false self have been recognized, when there is simply nothing left to be afraid of. The future self is courageous because the future self has already died, already dissolved, already passed through the void, and knows from direct experience that death is not what the previous self imagined. This courage allows action that the previous self could never have taken, risks the previous self could never have accepted, because the stakes have fundamentally changed. These qualities are not ideals to be pursued. They are natural properties of the future self, characteristics that emerge spontaneously when the patterns of the false self dissolve. You do not have to work to become present, to become creative, to become loving. You simply have to stop doing the things that prevent presence, creativity, love from manifesting. The future self is not an achievement. It is a recognition. It is not something you build. It is something you uncover. All the effort, all the practice, all the work is aimed not at creating the future self, but at removing the obstacles that prevent the future self from emerging. This is why McKenna was suspicious of spiritual ambition, of the drive to be enlightened, of the competitive comparison that turns the spiritual life into another arena for ego accomplishment. These attitudes are themselves patterns of the false self, masquerading as spiritual aspiration. The true movement toward the future self is characterized not by effort, but by surrender, not by grasping, but by releasing, not by achievement, but by acceptance. You do not become your future self by trying harder. You become your future self by letting go, by releasing the patterns that obstruct emergence, by trusting the process that is already underway, by recognizing that you are not the doer, but the done. And yet, and this is the paradox that cannot be resolved intellectually, but only lived, this surrender is itself the hardest thing the previous self can do. Letting go requires effort. Trusting requires courage. Accepting requires the deepest kind of activity, an activity that is not doing, an action that is non-action. The future self emerges not through passivity, but through what might be called active receptivity, an engaged openness, a participatory allowing, a collaboration with forces that exceed you while somehow being you. The emergence, once it begins, has its own momentum. You do not have to push it forward, you only have to not obstruct it. But obstruction is the habitual mode of the previous self. Resistance is what patterns do when faced with change. Clinging is what identities do when faced with dissolution. And so the emergence is not a single moment, but a process, a dance between the future self arising and the previous self grasping, between novelty and habit, between what you are becoming and what you have been. McKenna described this dance in terms of what he called the felt presence of immediate experience, the quality of awareness that arises when patterns thin and the void shows through. This felt presence is the hallmark of the transitional state, the signature of transformation in progress. It is characterized by an intensification of sensory experience, colors brighter, sounds clearer, textures more vivid, as if reality itself has been turned up, as if the dimmer switch of ordinary consciousness has been moved toward full illumination. This intensification is not an addition of something new, but a removal of something old. The removal of the filtering, the dampening, the habituation that normally keeps experience within manageable bounds. The felt presence is also characterized by what McKenna called semantic hunger, a yearning for meaning, for significance, for the kind of understanding that is not merely intellectual, but existential, not merely conceptual, but lived. In the transitional state, ordinary meanings seem thin, obvious, insufficient. You want to know not just what things are, but what they mean, not just how they work, but why they matter. This hunger is the future self reaching for nourishment that the previous self's diet could not provide, the nourishment of genuine insight, of truth that transforms rather than merely informs. And the felt presence is characterized by a peculiar relationship to time that defies ordinary description. The present seems to expand, to contain depths that ordinary present moments do not contain. Past and future seem to fold into the present, not as memories and anticipations, but as present realities, as dimensions of the now that are normally inaccessible. This is not time travel in the science fiction sense. It is the recognition that time as ordinarily experienced is a construct, a pattern, a way of organizing experience that is not the only way, and perhaps not the best way. These characteristics of the felt presence, sensory intensification, semantic hunger, temporal expansion, are all symptoms of pattern dissolution, all signs that the structure of the previous self is becoming transparent, all indicators that the void is showing through. They are not the future self, but its approach, not transformation, but the threshold of transformation, the moment when everything is still possible and nothing is yet settled. What settles transformation, what determines the specific shape of the future self that emerges, is what you do with this moment. Not in the sense of making something happen, but in the sense of what you attend to, what you open to, what you allow to organize the reconstitution that is beginning. The felt presence is a state of maximum sensitivity, maximum malleability, maximum responsiveness to organizing influences. And there are many such influences available, many attractors competing for your allegiance, many possible future selves seeking to incarnate through you. This is where discernment becomes crucial, the capacity to distinguish between futures that represent genuine novelty and futures that are merely recycled patterns in new disguises. The previous self had preferences, had desires, had images of what it wanted to become. These images do not simply disappear in the transitional state. They are still present, still active, still trying to shape the emergence. And many of them are not authentic futures, but projections of past needs, attempts by the previous self to perpetuate itself under the guise of transformation, to rearrange its furniture while keeping its fundamental structure intact. McKenna was acutely aware of this danger, the danger of what might be called false transformation, pseudo-novelty, the appearance of change without its substance. He saw it everywhere in the spiritual marketplace, in the teachers who had exchanged one identity for another without passing through the void, in the seekers who collected experiences without allowing themselves to be changed by them, in the entire culture of spiritual materialism that turns awakening into another form of acquisition. He knew that genuine transformation cannot be purchased, cannot be taught, cannot be reduced to a method or a technique, because all methods and techniques are patterns, and transformation is precisely the dissolution of patterns. How then to navigate the transitional state? How to distinguish genuine attractors from false ones, authentic futures from projections of the past? McKenna's answer was characteristically radical. You cannot know in advance. You cannot formulate criteria, apply tests, make certain judgments from within the transitional state. What you can do is trust the process. Trust that the movement toward genuine novelty has its own intelligence, its own capacity for self-correction, its own way of revealing what is false and guiding you toward what is true. This trust is not passive faith, it is active exploration. In the transitional state, you experiment, you move toward various possibilities, you try on various futures, you feel your way forward without committing prematurely to any particular direction. And as you experiment, You learn to feel the difference between what is genuinely new and what is merely comfortable, between what leads further into the unknown and what circles back to the familiar. The body knows this difference before the mind does. The felt sense knows it before the conceptual understanding catches up. And so navigating the transitional state is largely a matter of learning to trust these non-conceptual ways of knowing, learning to let the body lead, learning to follow the felt sense, learning to subordinate mental judgment to something older and wiser. This is what McKenna meant when he spoke of the wisdom of the body and the antiquity of the flesh. The body is older than the mind, older than language, older than culture, older than all the patterns that constitute the civilized self. It carries memories that extend back through millions of years of evolution, wisdom accumulated by countless generations of organisms navigating environments of unimaginable complexity. This accumulated wisdom is not lost in the transitional state. It is liberated. As the patterns of the civilized self dissolve, as the cultural conditioning relaxes its grip, the ancient wisdom of the body can speak, can guide the emergence toward configurations that serve life, that align with the deep patterns of organic existence. And beneath the body is something older still, the wisdom of the cosmos itself, the intelligence that organized matter into life, and life into consciousness, and consciousness into reflective awareness. This cosmic intelligence is not separate from you. It is what you are, at the deepest level, beneath all the patterns, beneath the body, beneath even the sense of being a separate self in a world of separate things. The transitional state opens access to this level, not always, not reliably, but often enough that anyone who has truly navigated the dissolution knows that there is something down there, something intelligent, something friendly, something that seems to want your transformation as much as you do. McKenna called this intelligence many names: the logos, the other, the Gaian mind, the mushroom, the alien at the end of time. The name does not matter. What matters is the recognition that you are not alone in the transitional state, that the process of transformation is not something you do to yourself, but something that is done through you, with your participation and consent, but not by your effort alone. This recognition is crucial because it relieves the burden of believing you must figure it all out, must make the right decisions, must navigate perfectly, or face catastrophe. You do not have to navigate perfectly. You only have to stay open, stay present, stay willing. The intelligence that organized a cosmos out of chaos can certainly organize a future self out of the material you provide. This does not mean you have no role. It means your role is different from what the previous self imagined. Your role is not to plan and execute, but to attend and respond. Your role is not to construct the future self, but to midwife its emergence, to provide the conditions, to clear the obstructions, to say yes to what is arising even when it frightens you, especially when it frightens you. And your role is to bring back what you find, to integrate the insights, to embody the changes, to allow the future self to manifest not just in your inner experience, but in your actions, your relationships, your presence in the world. This bringing back is the final movement of transformation, the completion of the cycle that began with dissolution. You entered the void, you allowed the emergence. Now you must incarnate what has emerged. And this incarnation is not automatic. It requires effort, requires commitment, requires the willingness to live differently, to be different, to let your transformation change your world as well as yourself. McKenna was insistent on this point. Transformation that does not manifest is not genuine transformation. The test of awakening is not the experience but the expression, not what you feel, but what you do. A genuine future self is not a private possession, a secret identity hidden behind the mask of ordinary life. It is a new way of being in the world, a new quality of presence, a new capacity for relationship. If nothing changes externally, if your relationships remain the same, your behaviors remain the same, your impact on others remains the same, then what changed? Where is the evidence that transformation occurred? This is harsh but necessary medicine. The spiritual world is full of people who have had powerful experiences, but not allowed those experiences to change them. They collect peak moments like trophies. They trade stories of their journeys. They develop sophisticated vocabularies for describing states of consciousness they glimpsed but did not embody. And meanwhile, their lives go on as before, the same patterns, the same conflicts, the same limitations. They have touched the future self, but not become it. They have visited novelty, but not allowed it to reorganize their existence. The antidote to this spiritual tourism is commitment, the decision, made not once, but constantly, to let transformation have its way with you. This commitment does not mean knowing what will happen. It means accepting that you do not know and being willing to proceed anyway. It means accepting that your plans and predictions are patterns of the previous self, and that the future self cannot be predicted, only welcomed. It means living in what McKenna called the creative advance into novelty, the forward edge where what has been meets what is becoming, where the known dissolves into the unknown, where each moment is genuinely new because you have released the patterns that made all moments seem the same. This creative advance is not comfortable. It is not safe. It does not offer the security of knowing what comes next. But it is alive, alive in a way that pattern-bound existence never can be, vibrant with the energy of creation, luminous with the light of awareness encountering itself for the first time. The future self lives in this advance. The previous self lives in retreat, in the desperate maintenance of patterns against the entropy that threatens them. The choice between these modes of existence is the fundamental choice every consciousness must make, not once, but in every moment, because every moment offers the opportunity to release pattern and enter novelty, to dissolve what has been and embrace what is becoming. There is a quality of attention that the future self brings to experience, a way of looking that sees more than the previous self ever could. Not more information, not more data, but more depth, more dimension, more meaning. The previous self looked at the world through the lens of its patterns, seeing what it expected to see, interpreting through established categories, reducing the infinite complexity of each moment to manageable simplifications. The future self looks without such lenses, or rather, looks with awareness of its lenses, which is almost the same thing. It sees its categories as categories, its interpretations as interpretations, its simplifications as simplifications. And in seeing them, it is not trapped by them. McKenna described this quality of attention as the hallmark of the truly psychedelic consciousness, not the visionary fireworks that draw attention in dramatic experiences, but the quiet transformation of perception that remains when the fireworks fade. The word psychedelic means mind manifesting, soul revealing. And what the psychedelic consciousness reveals is not primarily the objects of experience, but the experiencing itself, the way awareness constructs its world, the processes by which chaos becomes cosmos, the creative activity that underlies every perception. This revealed awareness changes everything. When you see how you construct your experience, you are no longer trapped in your constructions. When you see the patterns operating, you are no longer operated by the patterns. This is freedom. Not the freedom to do whatever you want, but the freedom to see what you are doing, to recognize choices where before there seemed to be necessity, to find space where before there seemed to be only constraint. The future self inhabits this freedom, not as an achievement, but as its natural state, the state that emerges when patterns dissolve and do not immediately reform. And from this freedom, actions arise that the previous self could never have taken, actions that are genuinely creative, genuinely responsive, genuinely appropriate to the unique demands of each situation. The previous self acted from patterns, from habits, from conditioned responses, from scripts learned long ago and applied automatically. The future self acts from presence, from direct encounter with what is actually happening, from fresh perception of the unique configuration of each moment. This difference between pattern action and presence action is subtle but profound. Pattern action is repetition. Presence action is creation. Pattern action serves the past. Presence action serves the present. Pattern action perpetuates the previous self. Presence action manifests the future self. And the accumulated difference between these modes of action, extended over time, creates entirely different lives, entirely different worlds, entirely different possibilities for what a human existence can be. McKenna saw this difference in civilizational terms as well. Culture, he argued, is essentially accumulated patterns, ways of thinking, feeling, acting that are transmitted from generation to generation, that provide stability and continuity, that allow complex societies to function, and culture serves important functions. Without it, we would have to reinvent everything from scratch in each generation. But culture also becomes a prison when it is confused with necessity, when its patterns are taken for truths, when its ways of being are assumed to be the only possible ways of being. The dominator culture of the contemporary world, the culture of endless growth, endless extraction, endless competition, is such a prison. It presents itself as the only realistic option, the only mature response to the conditions of existence, the inevitable expression of human nature. But this presentation is a lie told by patterns that want to perpetuate themselves, that have colonized minds and convinced those minds that pattern interest and self-interest are the same thing. They are not the same thing. The patterns serve themselves. They do not serve the selves they inhabit. And liberation, individual liberation, cultural liberation, species liberation, requires seeing through the lie, recognizing patterns as patterns, and choosing presence over perpetuation. This is why McKenna spoke of the archaic revival, the return to modes of consciousness and culture that predate the dominator pattern, that preserved for millennia a different relationship between human beings and the living world. These archaic cultures were not perfect. They were not utopias to be romanticized, but they knew something we have forgotten, something about the embeddedness of human life in larger patterns of meaning, something about the sacred dimension of existence, something about the necessity of periodically dissolving accumulated patterns and allowing novelty to emerge. The shamanic traditions that McKenna studied were technologies for exactly this dissolution and emergence. The shaman is one who has mastered the passage between worlds, between the world of ordinary pattern and the world of creative chaos, between the structures of daily life and the void from which structures emerge. The shaman dies and is reborn, repeatedly, ritually, as a regular practice rather than a one-time catastrophe. And in this repeated death and rebirth, the shaman maintains the fluidity that most people lose as they age, the capacity for genuine change, genuine novelty, genuine response to the evolving demands of existence. We have lost this technology, not entirely, but largely. We have medicalized the states of consciousness that shamans cultivated. We have pathologized the dissolution that is the precondition for emergence. We have created cultures in which pattern rigidity is rewarded and pattern fluidity is suspect. And the result is a civilization that cannot adapt, that continues running programs that no longer serve, that repeats patterns that have become destructive, that moves toward catastrophe because it has lost the capacity for the creative transformation that catastrophe avoidance requires. But the technology is not gone. It survives in fragments, in meditation traditions, in surviving shamanic cultures, in the underground use of psychedelic sacraments, in the experiences of artists and mystics and madmen who have touched the void despite cultural prohibition. And it is being rediscovered by scientists exploring consciousness, by therapists treating trauma, by seekers who know in their bones that the pattern-bound existence offered by contemporary culture is not enough, that there must be more to being human than the endless repetition of conditioned response. McKenna was a prophet of this rediscovery, not in the sense of predicting the future, but in the sense of calling his culture to its senses, of articulating what many felt but could not say, of providing language and framework for the transformation that was already underway. His genius was not in the details. Many of his specific claims have not held up, and he knew they might not, but in the vision, in the recognition that something unprecedented was happening to human consciousness, in the insistence that we had reached a threshold beyond which lies either transformation or extinction. We are still at that threshold. We have not crossed it. The transformation McKenna saw approaching has not completed, perhaps has not even properly begun. The patterns of the dominator culture still hold, the prison is still locked, the vast majority of human beings still live in the trance of conditioned existence, dreaming the dream that culture dreams through them. But the dream is thinning, the patterns are cracking, the void is showing through in more and more places, for more and more people, with more and more insistence. This is what it means to live in apocalyptic times. Not that the world is ending, but that the veil is lifting, that what was hidden is being revealed, that the patterns that seemed solid are becoming transparent. The apocalypse is not catastrophe, it is disclosure. And what is being disclosed is precisely the constructed nature of what we took for reality, the recognition that the world we inhabit is a world we made, and therefore a world we can remake. The future self that you are becoming is a participant in this remaking. Not an observer, not a passive recipient of changes that others create, but an active agent in the transformation of consciousness that is the transformation of reality. When you become your future self, you do not just change yourself, you change the world. Your new patterns of thinking, feeling, acting ripple outward. Your presence affects every presence you encounter. Your freedom inspires and enables the freedom of others. This is the responsibility that comes with transformation. Not a burden, but a privilege. Not a duty, but a joy. The opportunity to participate consciously in the most significant process the universe has yet undertaken. What happens right before you become your future self is, therefore, not just a personal event. It is a cosmic event, a moment in the evolution of consciousness itself, a contribution to the acceleration of novelty that is carrying everything toward the transcendental object at the end of time. You are not transforming alone. You are transforming with everything that transforms, for everything that transforms, as an expression of the transformative force that is the deepest nature of existence. This recognition changes how you approach the threshold. It is not just your dissolution you are undergoing, but the dissolution of patterns that bind more than you alone. It is not just your emergence you are midwifing, but the emergence of possibilities that exceed your individual existence. And the future self that appears is not just your future self, but an instance of the future itself, a local manifestation of the universal transformation, a particular expression of the general movement toward novelty and complexity and integration. This cosmic dimension of personal transformation is what McKenna saw most clearly, what he articulated most powerfully, what he embodied most thoroughly in his own life and teaching. He understood that consciousness is not a local phenomenon, that what happens in your awareness matters to all awareness, that the universe is not indifferent to your transformation, but is, in some sense, waiting for it, needing it, calling for it, reaching back through time to assist it. As the future self stabilizes, as the patterns of new existence begin to cohere and the void recedes, there comes a moment of recognition. Not recognition in the ordinary sense, not remembering something you knew before, but recognition in a deeper sense. The sense of being seen, of being known, of being met by something that has been waiting for your arrival. This is the greeting from the future, the welcome that the transcendental object extends to every consciousness that successfully navigates the transformation, that makes the passage, that crosses the threshold between what was and what will be. McKenna described this greeting in various ways, as the presence at the end of the psychedelic experience, as the voice of the Logos, as the alien intelligence that is not alien at all, but the deepest dimension of oneself. The descriptions differ because the experience exceeds description. It can only be pointed at, gestured toward, evoked through metaphor and approximation. But the experience itself is consistent across reports, across cultures, across centuries of human encounter with the transformed state. The sense of coming into relationship with something greater, something wiser, something infinitely loving and infinitely interested in your particular existence. This relationship is the context for the future self, the environment in which the new patterns unfold, the ground from which the new existence rises. The previous self was fundamentally alone, isolated in its patterns, separated by its boundaries, cut off from genuine contact with other beings and with being itself. The future self is fundamentally connected, not through the dissolution of boundaries, but through their transformation. They're becoming transparent rather than opaque. They're becoming membranes rather than walls. This connection is what makes the future self capable of the love we discussed earlier, the unconditional love that radiates rather than exchanges, that gives without requiring return. Such love is impossible for the isolated self, for whom giving is always diminishment, for whom other beings are always potential threats or potential resources. But for the connected self, the self that knows its participation in the larger life, giving is not diminishment but expression. Other beings are not threats but fellow manifestations, and love is not a transaction but a recognition of shared identity. This love is not abstract, it is intensely practical. The future self loves this person, this situation, this moment, not humanity in general, not existence in principle, but the concrete particulars of actual life. And this practical love expresses itself in action, in care, in attention, in service, in the willingness to meet each situation with full presence and full response. The previous self was capable of selective care, caring for those within its circle, ignoring or opposing those outside. The future self expands the circle to include everything within its awareness, which is ultimately everything, because the awareness of the future self is not bounded by the patterns that bounded the awareness of the previous self. But let us not romanticize. The future self is not a saint, not a perfected being floating above the difficulties of embodied existence. It still has preferences, it still makes choices, it still participates in the rough and tumble of a world where interests conflict and resources are limited. What changes is not the conditions, but the relationship to conditions, not the difficulties, but the response to difficulties. The future self meets difficulty as opportunity rather than obstacle. It finds freedom within constraint rather than only in the absence of constraint. It acts effectively precisely because it is not attached to outcomes, not desperate for success, not terrified of failure. This effectiveness without attachment is what the Bhagavad Gita calls karma yoga, action performed as offering, work done without concern for its fruits. And McKenna, though he drew from many traditions, recognized this quality as essential to the transformed life. The future self acts powerfully, acts consequentially, but does not identify with its actions, does not stake its being on their results, does not collapse into despair when they fail or inflate into pride when they succeed. Action flows from presence, accomplishes what it accomplishes, and returns to presence. The actor is not diminished by failure or augmented by success, because the actor was never really the actor, was always the awareness in which action arose, the space in which events unfolded. This recognition of oneself as space rather than content, as awareness rather than its objects, is perhaps the deepest shift that constitutes the future self. The previous self identified with its contents, with its body, its mind, its history, its hopes, its fears. The future self recognizes these contents, as patterns appearing in awareness, as waves rising and falling in the ocean of consciousness. This recognition does not reject the contents, does not deny their reality, does not attempt to escape from them into some imagined pure awareness. It simply sees them accurately, as temporary patterns in permanent presence, as relative forms in absolute being, as the play of appearance in the depth of the real. McKenna often said that the problem is not reality, but our relationship to reality. The world does not need to be changed. Our way of seeing the world needs to be changed. And this change of seeing is exactly what the future self accomplishes, not through effort, not through discipline, but through the dissolution of the patterns that made distorted seeing seem normal. When those patterns dissolve, accurate seeing arises spontaneously, not as an achievement, but as the natural function of awareness freed from obstruction. What does accurate seeing see? It sees novelty, the endless creativity of existence, the ceaseless emergence of configurations that have never existed before. The previous self, trapped in its patterns, saw repetition, saw the same categories filled with different instances, saw the same stories enacted by different characters, saw the present as a repetition of the past with minor variations. This is the fundamental distortion, the reduction of novelty to repetition, the assimilation of the genuinely new to the comfortably familiar. And this distortion creates the experience of boredom, of meaninglessness, of the flat grey world that stretches endlessly without surprise or significance. The future self does not experience this flatness because the future self sees what is actually there, the unique configuration of each moment, the unprecedented arrangement of forces that constitutes every instant, the radical freshness of an existence that has never been this way before and will never be this way again. This seeing is not an interpretation imposed on experience. It is experience itself, freed from the interpretations that dulled it. And in this freed experience, meaning is not absent, but everywhere. Not as something added to experience, but as the very substance of experience, as what experience is when it is not being reduced to something less than itself. This is the final gift of transformation, the ultimate benefit of becoming your future self. The recovery of meaning, the return to a world that matters, the re-enchantment of existence, the disenchanted world of modernity, the world of dead matter and random process, of meaningless suffering and pointless striving. This world is not reality. It is a hallucination, a delusion, a pattern-induced distortion that makes the living cosmos seem like a corpse. When the patterns dissolve, when the distortion clears, what remains is not the disenchanted world, but the world as it has always been, alive, intelligent, purposeful, saturated with significance, radiant with beauty. McKenna saw this world. He lived in it. He spoke from it. And his speaking was an invitation to everyone who heard it, everyone who read it, everyone who encountered his vision, to see through the trance, to dissolve the patterns, to become the future self that already exists in potential, waiting for you to die so it can live. The moment before you become your future self is the last moment of the trance, the final instant of the hallucination that you are your patterns, that you are separate, that the world is dead and existence is meaningless. And the moment after is the first instant of waking, of recognizing what you have always been, of seeing the world as it has always been, of living in the reality that was always there, hidden only by the patterns that took themselves for the world they obscured. This transition happens in no time, in the gap between moments, in the space between thoughts, in the silence between words. It cannot be located temporally because it is not a temporal event. It is the exit from temporal experience into the eternity that underlies time. And yet it happens to individuals, is happening now to countless beings, will happen eventually to all beings as the wave of novelty accelerates toward its asymptotic climax. You are standing at that threshold. You have always been standing there, whether you knew it or not. The dissolution has already begun the moment you were born, begun the moment consciousness emerged from matter, begun at the birth of the universe when novelty first differentiated itself from the void. Everything that has happened since then is the approach to this threshold, the long preparation for this moment when you finally step through. What happens right before you become your future self is nothing special. It is simply the last repetition of what you have always done, the last pattern, the last habit, the last automatic response. And then, in the space that follows, in the gap that opens when the pattern does not repeat, everything is new. You are new. The world is new. And the adventure that has been waiting for you, the adventure that is the true purpose of existence, the adventure of consciousness exploring its own infinite depths, that adventure finally begins. The future is not ahead of you. It is within you, waiting to emerge. And all you have to do, all anyone has ever had to do, is let go and let it.